Okay, come on, folks, go ahead and sit down, please. We're going to get started. I know, I apologize about the parking. It's Lunar New Year. I guess it was a good celebration for Dad. Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Denise. I'm George and May's oldest. Thank you all for coming today to celebrate the life of my father, George Koo. Your presence means so much to our family. I know that some of you have traveled across the country to be here with us. Quick logistics. First, I want to thank my niece Lauren for the wonderful slideshow that has been running as you came in, and we will play it again after all the speeches. I also want to thank my mother for her consultation behind the scenes as we plan this event. And quick logistics, the restrooms are out the back door. Take a quick left and a quick right. It's down Short Hoblet. Dad's sudden passing after his head injury on the pickleball court pains us greatly, but we have been comforted by the fact that his last memories would be of this sport he loved. And Dad would not have wanted us to focus on mourning his passing, but rather on celebrating his life. And as Mom pointed out, he wanted a big party. And looking at this crowd, we certainly got one. So we hope the tone today would be upbeat, funny even, because Dad never laughed as heartily as when he was laughing at himself. We can't cover all aspects of Dad's extraordinarily rich life, but Dad showed great passion and engagement in all he did and had a way of making friends everywhere. So together, you all represent many aspects and stages of his life and are testament to the depth and breadth of his impact. George came to the U.S. from China at age 11. His story sounds a little bit like that of a stereotypical Asian immigrant. A kid who knows no English when he lands here, but who, highly intelligent and motivated, science-minded, ends up at a top school in Haiti for his college degree, goes on to get a master's, doctor of science, MBA, and he even had the look when he was young, a skinny Chinese nerd with glasses. But George was a social creature, a natural born leader and doer from the get-go. He was voted 7th grade class treasurer less than a year after landing in the U.S. And in college, he organized and participated in numerous dances, sports competitions, and other social events with trained student clubs at other colleges, even traveling to other cities, including Philadelphia, where he met our mother, who was at Bryn Mawr. As an aside, George always thought he was pretty hot stuff. We teased him that, as a young man at least, he was a skinny, dirty-looking Chinese guy. And even Mom said that we kids might have been better looking had she married a white guy. But we really had to be smart. I'll touch briefly today on only one aspect of his career, not the complex technical details, I put some of that in the obituary, but rather how and why George found his vocation, a role true to his passion and who he was. With his training in chemical engineering, he initially took research jobs with scientific companies such as Boeing, Allied Chemical, Alza Pharmaceuticals, and the Stanford Research Institute. But George became antsy to do more applied science and for more connection to product and outcome, hence the MBA. And despite seemingly living the American dream, George took great pride in his Chinese origins, keeping up with his Chinese and retaining a love for Chinese culture and history. As a child, he brought with him The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, a novel about the adventures of feudal lords of 2nd and 3rd century China, often cited as the equivalent to Shakespeare and its impact on East Asian literature. He read this book so often that his copy literally fell apart at the seams. After China and the U.S. reestablished relations in the 70s, George jumped to Chase in New York to start a China Trade Advisory Group. This new job marked the start of a 30-plus year career as a cross-cultural business consultant with a variety of companies, including Chase, Bear Stearns, and Deloitte. As a young boy, George had dreamed of becoming the U.S. ambassador to China, and now he was a diplomat of sorts. He was fascinated to serve as go-between in the frustratingly slow cultural clashes and contrasting financial paradigms. He felt so lucky to have ended up with, as he put it, a front row seat to China's transformation from planned economy to a booming mixed economy that emerged to become the economic giant of today. The depth of his learnings from that era only strengthened his love for China, knowing as he did its history and the struggles it overcame. For years, he thrived on this best of both worlds, shuttling between his native and adopted countries, laying the foundation for later activities that other speakers will address. So I want to shift now to talking about Dad as my dad. When he started traveling so much, Dad worked hard to stay engaged with the family. This is before the internet, right? And phone calls were expensively difficult to organize. So I have letters from him to me, sent from California to New Jersey before we moved west, from China to Mountain View, Cambridge, and Atlanta. And in all his communications, written as well as in person, Dad always included advice. Moral advice, safety tips, career advice, even dating advice. You've heard of the 5 love languages? Well, there should be a 6th for dads, that of giving advice. Dad couldn't help himself. He generously wanted to share his knowledge with others as his way of showing he cared. He was passionate, engaged, pedantic, perhaps overbearing. But giving advice was Dad's love language. Of course, and I know my siblings and the other grandchildren might agree, whereas you in the audience might have a different perspective, but we thought such advice was often not solicited, helpful, accurate, or even advice he actually followed. We called you the ultimate dadsplainer. So, for example, Dad visited me freshman weekend in college, and in a moment of weakness, I mentioned the guy with whom I mistakenly become involved. Although I didn't ask, Dad told me, in fact showed me, how to get rid of him. He said, next time he puts his arm through yours and he puts my arm in his, he said, just let your arm go limp. Or this. I didn't know whether to be more embarrassed for him or for me. The advice he never followed. Once we had kids, Dad hammered us with the counsel that we should embrace our Chinese heritage and teach our kids Chinese. Of course, such would have been a lot easier if he and Mom had spoken Chinese while they were growing up, and not just when they wanted to keep secrets from us. One of the more pointless examples occurred a couple of years ago at a family reunion. My husband and I planned to take a quick hike, and Dad told us to be at my cousin Jeff's house at 5:30 for dinner. We agreed, but Dad could not stop himself from adding, and that means you have to allow enough time to shower and change before you... Thanks, Dad. On the upside, Dad always encouraged us to play sports, but he especially advised sticking with tennis, saying it would provide a lifetime of activity and friendship. His love of tennis was indeed one of his greatest gifts to me, and it became one of our strongest connections. We played first father-daughter, then mixed doubles, adult mixed doubles tennis tournaments here in Mountain View. About 8 years ago, Dad switched to pickleball, and once I started to play again, we had a sport that we could love to share once again. But my last example dates from the first time Dad and I played pickleball together at Mitchell Park. After I'd been playing 2 months, I got pretty irritated at his needless tips. Either obvious points or points with which I disagreed. We got into a big argument on the court. People probably thought we were taking the game way too seriously. but of course it wasn't about the game. Afterward, I decided it was finding time, at nearly 60, to reason with him about the dad's plan. I told him he gives too much advice, and because he says so many things that are so obvious, I get so annoyed that I can't listen when he actually has advice that would be helpful. To his credit, Dad listened carefully, indicated he understood, but then admitted, but how do I tell the difference? There's a rub. But thank you, Dad. Tennis and pickleball are both a huge part of my social life now. As a retired empty nester, I play both competitively and go on trips and have parties with my tennis and pickleball friends. The most important part of Dad's gift, however, was the joy with which he played. He showed us the value of competition, but also courtesy on the courts, complimenting one's opponents and partners, not getting upset when we missed or lost, and above all, of laughing and having fun. He exuded enormous joy in having all generations of the family together on the courts, regardless of ability. And of course, this is not just about the game. Dad always valued bringing family together, bringing people together. Maya Angelou said that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And Dad made us feel happy, joyful, and loved. Thank you.
Greetings. I am Helen, George's next younger. Can you hear me in the bags? I'm George's next younger sister, and I'm going to tell you first about how George and I grew up in China. Both of my parents were on the faculty of the Shan University on the southeast coast of China. In 1937, after the Japanese had invaded northern China, the university was moved to Chongqing, a rural town in the interior, to avoid being attacked by the Japanese. And that is how George and I both were born at Chongqing. He in 1938, I in 1941. My earliest memory is of George and I lying on a bed, face down, looking at the floodwater swirling under the bed. We were so fascinated. This is symbolic, I think, of our life growing up. He was my older brother who had to take care of me, and I was a younger sister who felt safe with him, and we were both so curious about observing the world as it appeared before us. We stayed in Shanting until the war ended in 1945, when we went to my mother's hometown, where Nancy was born. And then in 1946, the University of Shan had been rebuilt. In 1947, my father was sent to the University of Washington to do a PhD in fisheries biology. And when he finished, he was supposed to go back to China, where we were waiting for him. But in 1949, when the communists had defeated Chiang Kai-shek's government, they had sent for us. And my mom miraculously got us on the last plane out of Shannon, which was a military transport plane full of civilians. We flew to Hong Kong in August 1949, and then went to Philippines, and in November we went to Seattle. We arrived on a Saturday. Next Monday, George and I were at Lowhurst Elementary School, knowing exactly one word of English: water. In China, George had finished 6th grade, and I had finished 3rd grade. We were each ahead of ourselves in age by at least 1 year. The most important things that we learned in China were Chinese culture, customs, history, and Confucian values. After we got to Seattle, our father told Mom, these children are going to be Americans now. Let them learn English. Don't make them learn Chinese as well. And let them learn how to do things the American way. Well, to do things the American way, we had to unlearn many of those Confucian values, such as not aspiring above your status or your station, being modest, not drawing attention to yourself. Fortunately for me, George had a little trouble doing this and adopting new values, opening the path for me. Our education in China also instilled in us a fierce pride in being Chinese, in the Chinese culture, and in the superiority of the Chinese civilization. We never lost this pride, and this pride inspired George later in life to write prolifically and eloquently, explain China to Americans. Well, so back to that elementary school, where we didn't know any English. To teach us English, both of our teachers sent us out of the classroom where another student would tutor us in English readers. We got very popular that way, but they got out of class. And we learned to speak English well enough in a few months that we got along in all the other subjects. Dad's research assistant's pay could barely support a family of 6, Linda being born in 1950. So George got a paper route delivering a newspaper at the Seattle Times. Here, he showed his business acumen very early. He delivered papers on one side, I did deliver papers on the other side, but when it came to collecting our monthly fee, he had me go to every house, and when the door opened, I would go up, say, "Collecting for Seattle Times." We got extra big tips almost everywhere. Now, George's ambition got moderated from being an ambassador to being big mayor on campus. So he ran for student body office every year at junior high and high school. And if he hadn't done that, I never would have thought to do that, so I did the same thing. George aspired to go to top-notch university. He went to MIT and got a scholarship. If he hadn't done that, I wouldn't have gone to Stanford. George loved sports and was athletically talented. Our father had taught himself tennis by watching people play on public courts, and he taught us the rudiments: flat backhand, flat forehand, his kind of funky serve. And with that, George worked on the game. He played on the varsity team all 3 years of high school, the freshman MIT team, and the varsity team in sophomore year. But he dropped out of the team after that because it was affecting his grades during the tennis season. But he loved tennis with his passion. Yes, and he said, all his life. But about 8 years ago, he had hurt his foot, so he transferred that passion to pickleball. As adults, we both passionately wanted to travel up to other countries, and as our incomes and leisure time rose, we 4 siblings and our spouses began to travel often, frequently with friends. George spearheaded many of these trips along with me. We enjoyed going all over China and all over the world. But traveling took on a special meaning for the 4 siblings and their spouses when Nancy was diagnosed with dementia in 2011. Nancy loved to travel, so all of us tried to go with her on at least 2 major trips every year. These trips were precious, as they allowed us to bond with one another, have special quality time with Nancy, and help Bob take care of her. Our last trip of all us together was to Patagonia, which was cut short by the COVID pandemic in 2020. Last year, George and Fred Wang, somewhere here, planned a trip to see many sites in China, including where several ancient emperors' tombs had been recently discovered. We were to go in October 2024, and George was so excited and looking forward to that trip. But then he had his fatal accident in September. But George and I did take the trip along with Fred and 8 friends. So George did take us for the last trip. At every site, I felt his presence. In presence, I felt how proud he would have been of what had been done at each archaeological site. A magnificent museum had been built to display the tombs and the artifacts that were found. And each museum was packed full of Chinese tourists and school children who were so excited to see what was there. So this final trip turned out not to be a heartbreaking one, but a comforting and fitting way to say goodbye to my big brother.
My name is Lei Qi Wang, and I have an interesting story to tell about how George and I met. Most people do not know that George and I came from a first of all, we were born in the same year, 1938. And then we went to the same elementary school in Gulangyu, in Xiamen, the Xiamen University that was mentioned earlier. Gulangyu is a tiny, tiny little island about the size of our Angel Island in the Bay. And can you believe that we went to the same LBSA school, but we never met? I was so surprised we both met. Anyway, in 1949, we left Gulangyu. By the way, it's a very beautiful island. If you have a chance to go. It has the highest concentration of foreign consulates, 14 of them in that tiny little island. And also it has highest concentration of piano. And it has a piano museum and it has organ museum. So if you love those things, that's the place to go. And so in 1949, George, family came to the United States, and my family went to Hong Kong. And then eventually, back when I graduated from high school, I came over to the United States as well, but we never met. And in those days, our parents saw no future for us whether it be in Hong Kong or in China, not knowing what's going to happen in China. And so we came, but with a lot of enthusiasm, because we have heard so much about America, a land of opportunity, freedom, democracy. But as we both went through the schools, and we began to see things quite differently, very different from realities. And also, we grew up in the atmosphere during the civil rights movement led by Dr. Martin Luther King and also the anti-Vietnam War movement. So we began to question about our assumptions about America. And but we pretty much kept it to ourselves. And until when we started working, and then we began to see things that are quite different. And so in 1999, George and I finally met for the first time. And the occasion was a meeting that I convened in San Francisco, Chinatown, to talk about how we can develop a national strategy to fight against racism against Chinese Americans. And in particular, we were concerned that Dr. Wen-Ho Lee of the Los Alamos National Laboratory it's incredible. New York Times in March 6, 1999, put him on the front page and said that he was a communist spy and he helped China stole our most top secret nuclear secrets from the lab. And of course, immediately he came under investigation and they indicted in December, and he promptly put into solitary confinement for 9 months. And so George and I, and along with 12 other representatives of civil rights organizations, came together. But it's very strange at that time because, people actually cautioned me do you really want to get into a fight? Because the media is all over the media. And, in fact, New York Times, one of the reporters received Pulitzer Prize because he wrote that front page story fingering one belief when there was no evidence whatsoever. And in fact, the internal investigator, counterintelligence investigator, Robert Blumen, came to a conclusion that there was not a scrap of evidence against Honor Lee. And the only reason that he was singled out was because of his race. He said that in a Senate hearing. And then when I invited him to come to Berkeley to give a talk, he also repeated the same thing. And so George and I, from that meeting on, we became very good friends, committed to try to get freedom for Wan Ho Lee. And of course, we were not very successful because the whole country we've gone, berserk. Every day the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, ABC, NBC, CBS, all doing the same thing, ready to lynch them if you were let off. And in fact, it's just say that, we are going to keep him in solitary confinement. So he was in solitary from December 1999 to September 2000. So George and I became very good friends. We met and we had coffee, we had lunch, we had dinner. I discovered that George is quite a connoisseur. And in fact, I told just, very recently, I told him that I was going to come to Mountain View for that Herseyfelder's concert and performance on Rachmaninoff, the pianist. And in fact, he immediately said, hey, we're going to take it soon, but maybe we could coordinate. And then he said, there's a very nice restaurant across the theater called Kieran. Go there and try it out. Also, they just show me the elements. So, it's this kind of thing. But all of us, both of us and the other people, were very concerned since 2008. The Wan Ho Lee got freed with an apology from the federal judge. But since 2008, this country has a new policy for China called Pivot to Asia. This is actually the brainchild of Obama. And then picked up later on, by all the subsequent. And the one that really, moved this policy with a vengeance actually was, both Biden and Trump. And they did not go beyond. They did not stop it from this. And right now, that Chinese students are no longer wealthy. He signed the name in there with the United States. Before this whole thing happened, Chinese students studying in America had the highest numbers, like 300,000. And now there's very few that are coming in. They say that you're welcome to come study humanities and social science, but not hard science. And so we've worked through media communications, through the internet and emails, and then occasionally give talk, attend rally. We became almost like soul brother because George was the only one that I get to use the local dialect of Scott. Because I had nobody that I could talk with. But however, whenever I travel to any Southeast Asia countries or to Taiwan, I use that same dialect because that dialect was the lingua franca of Taiwan and also all the Southeast Asian countries. And so there's a kind of a feeling of closeness and intimacy when we both talk in the same language. Now, George, and I'm going to finish. George, of course, devoted his talent to writing terrific, eloquent, and often find quite militant article attacking kind of racism that is going on around the country. And I really, I wish I could write like George. I mean, George has a style and the, short sentences, but very eloquent and very much on target. And through him, I think the Chinese American community finally have a major voice out there providing a counter narrative representing the Chinese American view. And I am deeply grateful. So anyway, I was so happy that I finally had a chance to meet George in 1999 and with the kind of background that we had together, which, brought to my mind a Tang Dynasty Chinese poet by the name of Isaac E. A câu dịch có kể bản, people song, and in there's a line, that two-line factory, that really captured the essence of how I felt when I met George and then became good friends with him. 同是天涯淪落日，相見無幾曾相識。We seem to have the same journey through the world, and then we met. But when we finally met, we seem to know each other so well. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Alyssa, the youngest of George's 3 children. All 3 of us took after him in a variety of ways. As I've already heard a lot today, it's clear that his genes dominate our physical traits. Ever since we were children, we've been repeatedly told that we all look just like him. We didn't necessarily take that in a positive term. But we also took after him in other ways. Not to be overly confident like Dad, but we're all, pretty smart. Though that might have been more from Mom's side of the family. Dad's. Regardless, we all share a lot of his interests. As Denise has already demonstrated, she is an equally avid pickleball player and tennis player. Doug shared his competitiveness. There was no letting the kids win while playing games there, as well as his keen fashion sense. Okay, well, maybe I was more Doug trying to influence Dad. At least that's what he'd like us to think. Whereas I shared his love of reading, musicals, and falling asleep in public. Dad also influenced me in many other ways. My earliest memories of him are of him giving me guidance, advice, whether I was receptive or not, on how to play tennis, how to play backgammon, how to play cribbage, how to play the piano. That last activity might come as a surprise to some of you. You probably didn't realize that he knew how to play the piano, because he didn't. Well, a notable aspect of Dad's character was his eagerness to teach, and not knowing more than, or as much as, the recipient of the guidance never stopped him from generously sharing his expertise. No. He did foster a love of reading in me. I remember him bringing me back fairy tale books from Europe when he traveled there on business, and I still have his old battered copy of Edith Hamilton's Mythology, which started my lifelong love of the Greek gods. More profoundly, he inspired a love of Chinese literature in me, translated, unfortunately, on my part. Because of his influence, I read The Dream of the Red Chamber, The Journey to the West, and the book Denise mentioned, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, as well as many others. He also introduced me to the works of Robert Van Gulik,
Dutchman who actually translated the 18th century novel about Judge Dee and then wrote an entire series in English centered around the detective skills of the semi-historical Chinese Sherlock Holmes. I continue to appreciate Chinese literature and regret that we missed the opportunity to discuss Jin Wong's Legends of the Condor Heroes. He wanted to compare and contrast how the English translation was presented compared to the original Chinese. Dad's enjoyment of Chinese literature is not surprising. One of his hallmarks was his love and devotion to our cultural heritage, China. Not only did he travel to China in the early 70s before it was open to Western tourism and brought the three of us to China in 79, but as Helen mentioned, he repeatedly toured throughout the country, including to many outlying areas. His enthusiasm about China and Chinese culture influenced my decision to live there after college. His dedication to strengthening connections with our Chinese roots also manifested in his activism on both Chinese-American issues and improving U.S.-China relations, as Professor Wong mentioned. This included his decades of working as part of the Committee of 100, a nonprofit organization of prominent Chinese Americans dedicated to the mission of supporting Chinese American participation in all areas of American life and constructive relations between the U.S. and China. As part of his activism, Dad was never afraid to speak his mind. His massive bibliography includes numerous articles and speaking engagements speaking out against the irrational and bigoted U.S. government policies, including, as Professor Wong mentioned, the unfair persecution of naturalized Chinese American scientists such as Wenho Li and Sherry Chun, accused of spying and passing on U.S. secrets. Dad was passionate about the injustice they suffered when the distorted justice system and ultimately baseless accusations caused them to lose their jobs, their reputations, and their hopes of living the American dream. Dad also spoke out against China trade sanctions and embargoes, arguing that both countries benefit from free trade and that sanctions would have devastating consequences. Sadly, this is a lesson that we once again face under the current administration. Dad would have been unsurprised but steadfast in fighting against these prejudice and ignorant measures. While our relationship is notorious for my sometimes, frequent, sarcastic, and irreverent attitude, there's no filial piety here, I cannot deny that Dad's dedication to Chinese culture fostered my own interest in our heritage, and beyond my love of Chinese food, culminating in my ultimately unsuccessful attempt to study the Chinese language, my year living in China, and my engagement with the Chinese American legal community. So, while I rarely agreed with him to his face, more out of pure obstinacy rather than actual ideological disagreements, I am very grateful that we have his vast oeuvre of articles reflecting his legacy of activism to remember Jim Fai.
Hi, everyone. My name is Christine Xu, and George was my mentor. And I always found it to be a very funny story how we met. So the background is that I used to live in Taiwan for a long time, and there I started an organization called Oriented.com. We got people oriented to the Orient, and one of the things that most people knew us for were these oriented happy hours, which we ran simultaneously at the same time, same day, in as many as 19 cities around the world. And it started in Taiwan, and then we're in Beijing, we're in Shanghai, we're all over the place. And it turned out to be a really big organization. But the challenge was that I was the only full-time person. And in the back of my mind, I always thought, gosh, I could really use some help here. So scroll forward so many years, and now I'm living in the Bay Area, and I'm still running this organization. And randomly, a friend of mine called me up and said, hey, I've got these extra tickets to this gala. at the Four Seasons Hotel in San Francisco. Do you want to come? And I was like, Four Seasons Hotel, for those who don't know, it's just this incredible hotel, very fancy and swanky. And I thought, yeah, free food, I'm there. And so, I was just tagging along with my friend, and I show up. And I didn't really know what this was about. And I show up, and it was this huge ballroom, and there was a stage, and there's lights and cameras. And, I looked around the room, and I saw, like, dignitaries and senior executives and, officials from the Chinese embassy. And I thought, whoa, this is going to be cool, really cool. And so when the program began, this woman comes out, and she's elaborately dressed, and for the next 20, 30 minutes, Maggie may remember this differently, but this is how I remembered it. She was singing and dancing across the stage and talking about herself and telling us about this book that she read. It was a company she started. I was like, where am I? What is happening here? And then eventually she introduces someone named George Koo. And out comes George Koo, and I'm going, wow, this is going to be really interesting, because now I'm expecting him to dance across the stage and the scene. And then, of course, it ended up that he was the keynote speaker of the evening. And he started talking about U.S.-China relations. And the minute he started talking, I sat up straight, and I stared at him, and I thought, oh my God, I don't know who this guy is, but he will understand what I'm trying to do with Oriented, because it was all about connecting international professionals together who are bilingual, working in Asia, going to China, going to Hong Kong, Singapore. And I was like, I have to talk to this man. And so the very next day, I wrote him this huge email. I think if you print it out, it's probably 2 pages long. And I was like, George, you don't know who I am, but I'm running this thing called Oriented.com, and you will understand what I'm talking about. I have to meet you. You have to meet me. Please, will you please? And so, when I think back to it, I'm like, what was I thinking? Was I crazy? But George graciously agreed to meet with me. We met for coffee, and that was the beginning of a many-year relationship in which he was my top mentor, helping me through the things that I was challenged with Oriented. So, George, anytime I reached out to him and I said, George, I need help, I don't know what to do here, he always said yes. Well, now that I've listened to the Swag, you see, at the time I thought, gosh, I'm really bugging him. He must be really annoyed, that I keep taking up this time. But now I realize that he was eating it all up. But until today, I thought, gosh, George is spending all this time with me. It wasn't like I was calling him every day, but every couple of months, every half year, I'm like, George, I really need to talk to you. There's something going on. I don't know what to do. And he always said yes. We met for coffee. He came over for dinner, and May would often come too, so I got to know May as well. And so very quickly, this mentor-mentee relationship turned into a genuine friendship that never ended. And George wasn't just an advisor to my business, but he actually was an active participant, and he ended up having a vested interest in my success, to the point where, he, on one of his trips to Beijing, he planned it around one of my Oriented happy hours in Beijing and attended the networking event, met with my leadership team there. I was involved in planning this really big APEC International Career Fair, and I asked George if he would be the keynote speaker, and he said yes. I had an investment bank approach me about wanting to help me sell Oriented, which is something I'm not familiar with, and so I was like, George, I need help. And in fact, I found an old email that I wrote summarizing my meeting with him, and it said, Words of Wisdom by George Koo. And he even agreed to be the guest speaker at our 10-year anniversary of the Oriented Happy Hours here in the Bay Area. So, George wasn't just someone who gave me advice. He actually really got involved in what I was trying to do. And, very quickly I realized that it was right up his alley with U.S., China, Taiwan relations. And so I was just telling somebody at the table, it's like, probably inevitably I would have come into George at some point, but the nature by which we met is that I demanded he be my mentor. And so within the first year, I guess I learned more about him. He was this prominent leader in the Asian American business community. He was part of Committee of 100. He wrote for so many publications like New Yorker Media and Asia Times. And I always kept thinking, how can I thank this man? I mean, he has everything. He's doing everything. And sure, I'm paying for coffee and he came over for dinner, but how can I thank him? So one day at one of our meetings, he starts going off about his opinions about what's happening with U.S.-China relations and, just sharing his knowledge and really kind of going on about it. And I go, George, you really should have your own blog so you can share all this knowledge with the world. And he goes, what's a blog? And so, we were kind of joking about this at that time, but a couple of days later I thought, I can actually set up a blog for him. I can do this for him, and it would be, my gift to him, and hopefully he'll do something with it. So I set up the blog, I registered georgeku.com, and then I met with him again, and I taught him how to, post an article. And then I sat back, and when you give someone a gift like this, you don't know if they're ever going to use it. But very quickly, he just took right to it. And when I was looking back and preparing for the speech, he actually wrote or posted 556 articles on georgeku.com. Running the gamut of 42 different topics. And he had even taken the time to post backdated speeches that he made and articles that he had written. So I set this up for him in 2007, but he backdated it all the way to 1993. And so, I'm a terrible gift giver, but this one I was like, yeah, I nailed it. And so as I was preparing for the speech, I'm reading through his blog, and I fell upon the very first one that he had posted, backdated in March 1993. And it really jumped out at me, and I want to share with you an excerpt of it because, first of all, in it, he is admonishing a friend. And I started laughing and like, oh my God, George, here you are, your very first post, and you're like bashing someone, right? But in so doing, in that writing, George really reveals the values by which he himself lived. And so I'm going to share an excerpt with you and see if you can figure out who this friend is. And I'll just let you know it's not anybody sitting in this room. Okay. Let me see if I can channel George here again. Because I get exasperated and frustrated with my friend from Asia. He has many endearing qualities, but one major fault. He starts many projects with great enthusiasm, but brings hardly any to a satisfactory conclusion. After many discussions and exhortations, I have reduced the issues to 4 Chinese characters. Here is his love for Chinese culture. 金文准系. My hope is that the slogan will become entrenched in my friend's consciousness and thus help him towards becoming a more effective person. Everything starts with Jing. To be Jing is to be focused and organized, to have a purpose in life, to know one's abilities and limitations, and to concentrate the energy and resources for maximum effectiveness in achieving those goals. An organization is Jing when it has a clear mission and objectives consistent with that organization's mission, strength, and capabilities. Next is Wen, meaning stability and steadfastness. Those who know the meaning of Wen have their feet firmly planted on the ground. They select business, product, or career paths based on realistic assessment of their capability, of their relative advantage vis-a-vis their competition, and of the market conditions and prospects. The merit of Zun is probably easiest to understand and perhaps most difficult to achieve. To me, Zun means precision and exactness. I believe to be successful in life, a person must strive for perfection. A person must strive for perfection. A person who is sloppy and is frequently guilty of just getting by will soon be known as unreliable and not trustworthy. An organization that continues to put out shoddy goods will soon lose credibility and go out of business. She means fine, detailed, and meticulous. In other words, the fourth component of qualities to succeed is attention to details. Only with the habitual attention to details can a person avoid mistakes from oversight and anticipate problems in the action of competition. She is a person or organization that thinks of everything to make sure that the attention is carefully spent and implementation flawlessly complete. I believe that if my friend would practice Jingwen Qi, he would become more effective and productive, take greater pride in his work, improve his self-image, and will be more likely to survive and grow. The Chinese are partial with slogans, and I hope Jingwen Qi could become a battle cry for the betterment of its people and raise its competitiveness. Does anybody know who that friend is? China, exactly. He's admonishing the whole country of China in his very first post. But in so doing, he is expressing the values by which he lived, which is also the man that I knew as my mentor. And so it goes without saying that I feel so honored to have, not just to have George as my mentor, but also George and Nay as my lifelong friends. And as I was thinking about all of this, I think that if there was ever a way to honor his legacy, that I, and perhaps many of you in this room, can also take the time to be a mentor to someone else and share your knowledge with them. P.S., the last thing I want to say is the woman that I spoke about earlier at that gala, her name is Diana Liu. She's actually a multi-talented, very successful business executive who wrote a book called Daughter of the Yellow River, and George was also her mentor.
Hello, my name is Mike Kine, and I've had the privilege of playing and being friends with George for 4 or 5 years, playing pickleball, that is. I will say at the onset that this is not my typical pickleball attire. I usually do not wear the tie. So as I was heading here, I heard that pesky little groundhog, Pescatani Phil, actually did see his shadow, which means that I can continue for another 6 weeks to talk about George, according to tradition. I'm sure we have no difficulty filling up the time. George, with all the things we've heard today, I was thinking about what we could potentially even label this discussion of George, and one of the titles that came to me was 50 Shades of George. So many different aspects of George that we could be talking about. But what I really wanted to do was highlight and honor his character, which we've heard here already, and his great sense of humor. For those of you who aren't familiar with pickleball, this is an interesting game where otherwise sane people stand pretty close to each other and whack yellow balls at each other with high speed, armed with the latest military equipment to their pals. This is something that George took great pleasure at, particularly when he would hit a great shot. He would actually laugh. So that gave me the permission to laugh back accordingly with it. Now, when George would show up on the court, he had a certain style. He would kind of wait on the side like he was in the starting blocks, and he would look out at the landscape, he'd peruse it. And he would sort of walk to the other side, walk back before placing his pal. Now, I'm not exactly sure exactly what he was doing, but one time he either went to the other end of the court, did a flip around to the left, flipped to the right, and when he came back, I said, George, are you auditioning for the Shan Ballet? But he really did have this knack for picking the right place to be. I thought that maybe he was being aided by a knowledge of Feng Shui or the game of Go, which he knew about, or maybe even ChatGPT, which I never knew what the GPT stood for, but now I think it stands for George Pickleball Technology. He had this thing about paddles. There were so many paddles in pickleball, there's so many brands and so many styles. He said, I'm going to beat this. And he went on Temu, the website, and Alibaba, and he bought an exact replica of my $250 paddle for $15. And then he said to me, you know, Mike, all these pickleball paddles, if all these pickleball paddles here and in the world could be laid end to end, it'd probably be a good thing. So while we go to the sidelines after playing in between games, you would see people wearing an array of assisted devices. We have a range of copper-infused knee braces, ankle, wrist, and foot support, bracketry. Many of these were supplemented by pressure-inducing ankle socks and leggings. We also had an array of elbow and rotator cuff recovery tools. Rotator cuffs were our specialty. And this band of Battle of Our Warriors often looked like a mixture of Prisoners of War, a telethon, or Grey's Anatomy. When you'd see this crowd, you'd often think that maybe FEMA was about to arrive. And we would talk about these ailments and various conditions of the body that we deal with, and George had a name for this. He called it the organ recital. I thought it was, I am an OD, and I called it the orthopedic surgeon's retirement program. Now, amidst all of these things, George was very proud of the way he looked. In spite of this, he even told me right before his 86th birthday that he hadn't shaved. Somebody told him he hadn't shaved in 20 years. He looked like he was 86 when he was 66. So this is George making fun of himself, this self-deprecating year. But we did share a common ailment, and this was a bad back. Now, George and I would share techniques on how to deal with the bad back. In fact, one of the things he said is that if my back was a car, it would be on recall. And then we would go ahead and start sharing some technology together. First, it was one of these copper-infused belts. You've probably seen them at CVS. He'd strap it around his waist, and that worked pretty well for a certain amount of time. And then that started fading a little bit, and I found this electronic device on Amazon called a transhuman, a trans-electron neurostimulation device. This really excited George. So he placed this device that had pads on his back. He wore that, and it worked pretty well for a couple of months. Then eventually he said, you know, Mike, it's just not working anymore. What else you got? So I had to break out the nuclear option. I had to go to my medicine cabinet and break out the drugs. Actually, it was the cream. Voltaren cream. This was George's favorite cream, and this worked for his back particularly well. In fact, one of the things George said, we said there was a riot. He said, of all these things you're giving me, about 30% of them are going to have a placebo effect. What I'm going to do is take all three of them together and get to 90%. So then there was the actual play on the court. This is where George really showed his unique sense of humor. First time I was out there, I was playing right next to him, and I got pretty close to him, and he looked over to me and he said, hey, Mike, you know that side mirror on your car? There's a little slogan on there. And this refers to me. It says, objects may be closer than they appear. So this is a way of telling me that, I was getting a little bit too close. And then he would kind of like, lightheartedly sort of play with me. I remember one time I was approaching the net, I was trying to figure out the score, and he was on the other side, and went to pick up the ball, and George was at the net at the same time. I said, "What's the score, George?" And he looked up at me, handed me the ball, and said, "It's 9-1-1, Mike. Kind of an emergency, isn't it?" Another time, he was learning the game still, and I went over this dreaded line, which in pickleball is called the kitchen, and he just yelled out to me. He said, "Mike, it's just like at home. Stay out of the kitchen." And then another time, I went extremely into the kitchen, almost hit the net, and he said, "Mike, you were so far into the kitchen, you were taking leftovers out of the refrigerator." Then we had Monica, who many of you know, introduced a new pal to a bunch of us and said, "Why don't we all go in, we need 4 of us, and get the new owl pal. This is the quiet pal." Because pickleball, for those of you who know, is pretty loud. So we got the owl pal and reduced it to about 40 to 50 decibels, half the level of sound. George looked over to me and he said, "Mike, why is it that the loudest guy in pickleball has the quietest pal?" Now, these are the ways you would think about things. So when you'd be done playing, we'd often retreat onto the side. Maybe the pickleball players here would know this. We called it executive session or the campfire. This may be the closest that most of us get to going to Burning Man or Coachella, but this was our little celebration of everyone. It was carefully placed in between a large storage locker and a dog park where squirrels would be chased by canines. This was our area. After having been basically thrown out of 3 other areas, this is where we went. And you would see people going to their cars and bringing things back. You would watch a whole brigade of limping, fatigued warriors wheeling exotic coolers and rickety chairs. It was a sight to behold, honestly. And we served only the finest cuisine at these luncheons that we have after eating. Nutritious foods such as peanut butter-infused pretzels, pico-flavored potato chips, beef jerky, whose ingredients nobody would ever dare read. And we did this and more on George's 86th birthday. And May was there as well. We even broke out our finest silverware and our plastic cups to serve our finest whiskey, Bushmills whiskey prohibition recipe. And we would sit there and drink. Now, this prohibition recipe, this is what the Colonel was making when he wasn't making the fried chicken. This was the drink that we would often have on the sidelines. And we also would have a special chair that George would sit in. And in fact, we even have that chair here today that May gave to Chuck. And Chuck, I'd like to ask you to hold up the chair. There it is. This was George's chair. And often we would sit on irregular terrain where it was kind of bumpy and lumpy. And in those cases, we had to limit George to 1 drink. And he would always say, at these occasions when we would drink, his expression was to say, "Gangbei, gangbei." And it took us a while to understand what that meant. First, I thought it meant cheers, but I wound up learning that it means dry cup. Leave your cup dry. And it even inspired the creation of a shirt, which some of our pickleball friends are wearing here today, which actually says, "Be like George, ganbei." And there's a picture of a paddle and all that. And you'll see many people in the crowd. But I remember at the end of that occasion, he walked out and he was leaning on May and he was about to drive the car. And I never knew if he got home But I did know that the next day, the very next day, true story, I was online at CVS and he was in front of me and he turned around and he had a big bottle of Pepto-Bismol, Alka-Seltzer, and like a case of Tums. So, also want to say that pickleball, for those of you who know the game, we consider it a great democracy where others don't know each other's personal histories. We often don't know about prior lives and achievements. But in the case of George, we knew. The stories became folklore. They expanded. They were almost like Yogi Berra stories. You know, did you hear this one about George? He did ooze a certain kind of wisdom, the confidence that people talked about. He had a certain omniscience, all-knowingness to him, and a gravitas. He was the kind of guy you'd want to be hanging out with, and you almost hope would rub off on you a little bit. And you knew he had the secret to a happy life, and he knew how to balance work and play, and he had a joyous circle of family, friends, and associates. And he took an active leadership role as well. He served as the president of the Mountain View Tennis Club, and in an act of ambassadorial diplomacy, he also was the interim head of the Paperball Club. And as you know, those two always have issues to talk about. I often said about George with his 360-degree view, I said, George, you are what I would call a peripheral visionary. You can see all around you. And he kind of liked that. But I would like to say that in the case of George's wonderful and colorful life, it was anything but a cup or a vessel running dry. In a more spiritual way, I think we could really say that in George's case, his cup runneth over. And even today, as our hearts are heavy, I know George would want us to raise our glasses one more time and toast to a life well lived. And all of us to say one more time, and if you'll join me, let's say, Ganbei. Ganbei, my friend, we love you, we miss you, and will always be with us, and us with you. And we know you wanted your epitaph to say, I wanted to make a difference. And I'm happy to say today, my friend, mission accomplished.
All right, you guys are so happy to see me because, first of all, I'm George's favorite child, but most importantly, I'm the last speaker. Actually, I did not know. George never brought anything home from his trips for me. No letters, no books. Probably because he was dealing with phone calls from the police and other things that dealt with me. Right? So, you know, a lot of times at services like this, you highlight words that really signify or are symbolic of the person. I'm going to turn that upside down a little bit, and I'm going to use words that do not describe George. So these are words that do not describe my father, and some of them have been highlighted already. So the first word is awake. He could fall asleep anywhere at any time of day and literally at the drop of a hat. So on my couch in my house, that was child's play. On the tours of China or Costa Rica, he would fall asleep before the door even closed. Crowded, like at dinner table, in a crowded restaurant, you look over, asleep. Actually, not just a dinner table, breakfast table. Asleep. It was really a talent. Anytime, anywhere. The second word, we touched on this a little bit, I would not describe him as fashionable. My earliest memory, we go to the tennis courts actually here at Ranksdorf in Cuesta Park, and he would come out in light blue polyester shorts, and this was before Lululemon made polyester cool. So black socks pulled up to his knees versus white tennis hat. Fast forward, just a few months ago, my cousin Amy got married to Alex, beautiful wedding in Aurora. Black tie, so he actually shows up to the wedding in a tuxedo, which I was shocked. We didn't have a tuxedo. That was good. Unfortunately, he paired the tuxedo with his tennis shoes. And of course, the tennis shoes with the bunion holes cut out. That was his sense of fashion. he coined the term hand-me-ups in our family, and this was my attempt at kind of giving him some clues or what never worked. Another word that did not describe my dad was tactful. So he would come to, all my kids played tons of sports, and he would come to all the kids' sporting events. He would sit in the bleachers with all the other parents, and inevitably someone would make a mistake. Not my kids, of course, and he'd say, "Oh my God! Why did she miss that ball?" Sometimes he would even add, "She's not very good. Why is she even on a team?" This was said in the middle of the bleachers with all the other parents there. This was not said in his inside voice. This was their feelings as guys. And then we all learned to kind of watch the game somewhere else, or let them stay there. But the silver lining is he did not miss many games. He loved going to as many games as he could. I think related to that, subtle is not a word you got used to describe him. In a restaurant, if he needed something and the waiter was across the restaurant helping another table, it was now. So the waiter knew. His views on China, U.S., not so. China right, U.S. wrong. Clear and simple. No is another word that I would not describe. I would say it does not describe my dad, much like my good friend Ray. He never said no to anything. Would you like a beer? Yes. Would you like to play ping pong? Yes. Would you like to play a card game? Yes. Want to try a new restaurant? Yes. And that was really his spirit. He really was a fun person to be around. We touched on this a little bit. Another word that I would say that does not describe him, dull. Right? So he came to the U.S. not speaking English, and he actually went to MIT and Stevens Institute, which are two remarkably hard institutions to get into. So pretty impressive. I would say timid does not describe our guy. Not only did he achieve all this, but he achieved this at a time when diversity was just a word in the dictionary. I understand diversity is going to be taken out of the dictionary. He said the word. He played tackle football as a 140-pound monster. Can you imagine that? And he was Chinese. You can imagine what these big white guys were thinking. Like, I'm going to get some of that Chinese guy. And then he left. He changed from his educational background, chemical engineering, went to China trade, which we talked about. Again, just not timid. I think, as you can tell by all the people in the room, another word that will not describe my dad is unlikable. Like, he really, truly was liked by many people. And I think what's really been great about having the months between his passing and now is my mom, my sisters, and I have all had these wonderful stories that talk about who he was. And it's really interesting to see your father through the eyes of other people because the relationships are different. I didn't get a chance to say goodbye to my dad. And if I did, what would I say? I would say, you were right, I should have learned to speak Chinese. I would say, thank you for showing me why it matters to be well-read and informed. I would say, thank you for showing me, or thank you for being courageous and entrepreneurial to give me all the opportunities I've had. I would say thank you for showing me how to be good-natured and not take yourself too seriously. I would say that we'll miss your smile, your humor, and your upbeat demeanor. And if he were here today, he would be smiling. He would be happy. He would be happy to talk to anyone. He would have an interest in what you're saying. He would be thinking of ways to help you. Of course, he'd be itching to get back on the pickleball court. And he'd want to take a quick nap before he goes out. But again, thank you all for coming. And really, but even more than that, thank you for all the stories that you've shared, because those have really been incredible, meaningful. I know it to my mom. She's really enjoyed all those. So if you haven't had a chance, please sign the book in the back and stick around if you can for a quick bite. But again, thank you all.